Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Michael Braun Lipset. Michael works in the broad area of music and education. He is a scholar, an author, an educator, an artist, a creative producer, and a hip-hop head. His contributions sit at the intersections of critical arts pedagogies, education change, pushout re-engagement, teacher preparation, and social justice. He is a published researcher and podcaster, having produced the Spotify original podcast series Record Ed Arts and the Stanford d.school-produced sound practice. He also serves as director of For Learning, 4 as in the number 4, an international nonprofit working on school transformation through the recording arts and culturally sustaining pedagogies. Hey, Michael, thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
That's pretty impressive. Could you please tell us a little more about what your research interests are and why you do what you do?
Sure. I'm very interested in education change broadly, and what that means. Your question as we prepared for this was, should this in my bio be educational change or education change? And we got to the place where no, it's education change. We're working on changing the state of education, right? And specifically through student-centered, culturally sustaining pedagogical approaches to teaching and learning, which by and large also means supporting existing education systems in becoming more student-centered and democratic. So all of the systems in the anthology of democratic schooling, the literature and field of studies covering democratic schooling, such as community meetings, advisory models, competency-based progressions of learning, and then all of the best practices around teaching and learning in the classroom that support those things as well, like social emotional learning, project-based learning, phenomenon-based learning, learning productions, which we can talk a bit about today. And I care deeply about this work because I really did not like my own schooling experience, even though it was said that I was attending one of the best schools in the country for my high school experience. It was a private school in St. Paul. I found it suffocating. I found it boring. I wondered why we were moving from 45-minute block to 45-minute block, learning subjects that were disconnected from each other with no real connection to our lives outside of the school. And it then happened that my most impactful learning experience in high school was offered to me by my advisor, who was a musician and a math teacher and had a recording studio in his home, in his basement, in fact. And he noticed that I was pretty disconnected, disaffected as a student, but that when it came to music and poetry, I clocked right in, right? I lit up. And so he invited me to his recording studio, and I made some music, of course, having gotten it cleared by my mother at the time. It was a bit of a bizarre question. Can I go record music in my math teacher's basement? Luckily, she did her due diligence and vetted the experience ahead of time, allowed me to do so. I made my first album and just fell even more deeply in love with music, but also hip-hop culture. So that, for me, was one of the first light bulbs around teaching and learning as something that could be fundamentally different than what we're actually offered by our teaching and learning institutions at the high school level. And then I later came to find out about public alternative re-engagement charter school in St. Paul called the High School for Recording Arts, which has informed everything I do to this day. It was started in '98 by a hip-hop artist, 4 young people who'd been pushed and kicked out of other schools, and so had it fundamentally to be something different, because those students that were coming to him seeking the opportunity to make music were already over it. They didn't want anything to do with school as it had been offered to them. And here was somebody with the resources to say, you know what, schooling could be different. Let's turn the recording studio into your school and do your learning behind a microphone. And so I've been working ever since to make that opportunity, that school, and the things that make that school possible more widely available.
It's really interesting. But when you were in high school, were you the only one who started recording in your teacher's vetted basement?
No. He actually was the head of the annual Battle of the Bands, oftentimes participated himself in the Battle of the Bands with a band that was composed of him and other students. So I didn't know that. I actually had no real interest in a Battle of the Bands because you don't really find hip hop artists in a battle of bands, right? We don't consider often hip hop artists bands. But there I was, I became very close friends with this person. He became a mentor of mine, and slowly thereafter started to understand the long arms of his musical reach throughout the student body.
It's really interesting. Why hip-hop music? I've had other guests on the show, and they're big fans of death metal. And today we have you, a wonderful guest, and you're interested in hip-hop. Is it a generational thing, or is there something about hip-hop that speaks to you or permits you to express yourself in a certain way that other musical mediums don't?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a generational thing because some of my best friends in high school actually were huge death metal fans. But for me, it was certainly, I don't know why or how I got there. Maybe it was having an older brother who was always the coolest kid in school. But hip hop always had a stronger appeal to me. Maybe it's the swag, maybe it's the language. I mean, for sure, it's all of those things and so much more. But it was also a deeper ability of hip hop to speak to the unknowns that I had at the time. I always wondered from a very young age why we're sold this world of opportunity and positivity and promise. And yet all you have to do is step out your door to see people without housing, people without food, go to the local food shelf and understand that there's also people battling substance abuse. There's gang violence, there's warfare, there's a whole slew of poverty, and all of the, accompanying issues it begets tell us that the world we're sold is not the world that exists. And so I wanted to know what that was. I wanted to know how people were reacting and what was being said by the folks on the receiving end of the systems that produce those ills. And I found a lot of those answers in hip hop. And it really wasn't until much later in life that I understood that the discord I felt with the world was not a byproduct of my racial or socioeconomic or gender identity, whereas the world of hip hop and the artists who created it, for those folks, it absolutely was something that was informing and directly impacting the creation of the culture. And so I had to have a separate personal reckoning with my relationship to hip hop later in life, and am happy to talk about what that means. It is very much connected to history, so it's a relevant conversation. But ultimately, came to understand hip hop culture in terms of its relationship to teaching and learning as one of the few arts-based, youth-led, revolutionary cultures, which death metal is not entirely. Punk rock is in some ways, but I would say mostly in the sense that it also is actually a musical genre that was started by Black musicians. And, again, if we get into the historical conversations and origins of these many, subcultural or cultural movements, we really, at the end of the day, will often come back to Black creators, and then the next step is white creators taking that work, right, and selling it to a white audience with a white face and so on and so forth. But anyways, that's why hip hop for me.
So hip hop, if I understand correctly, is not just political. It's also a philosophical endeavor or an existential endeavor in certain ways.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that most art forms require you to reflect on your state of being. Absolutely. One of the most important ways in which I advocate for the inclusion of arts in teaching and learning is by pointing out the fact that it is through the arts we can foster self-knowledge, knowledge of self-awareness, social, emotional, and metacognitive understandings of who we are and how we interact with the people in the world around us. But you don't necessarily get an overlay of criticality from something like ballet or oil painting or ceramics, right? The traditional capital A art forms or classical music is also a perfect example, that most schools place a primacy on, and behind which are often traditionally white European creators, right? A lot of students don't see themselves in the arts curriculum that schools offer precisely because they aren't the art forms that speak to their heritage cultures.
Very interesting. Does your own cultural background play a role in your approach to hip hop or your love for hip hop? Because you've mentioned that it like most music, its source is from Black culture in the United States. And you've referred to that more than once. So I'm just curious, you're not African American, but there's got to be some kind of connection there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question. I identify as Jewish American, cisgendered, white, mostly heterosexual, European on my mother's side, and to that end, would say that insofar as there were a number of Jewish folks, white Jewish folks involved in hip hop early on, hip hop is absolutely a part of Black and Latinx cultures, and by and large, considered a part of Black culture predominantly. And so, I alluded to it earlier, but there was a point at which I realized that actually my involvement in hip hop as somebody who is seeking to make a career out of my creative hip hop productions was very appropriative, even though I did my best to make it appreciative of hip hop and its founders and all of the tenets that are housed within the culture of hip hop. But for me to be who I am in that space and claim it as my own, it cannot be understood but in any other way but as an act of colonialism, right? And so it was almost at that very same time that I said to myself, wait, I no longer am interested in pursuing a professional career in hip hop. I don't find it appropriate. And actually, this realization kind of turns me off from it. So I still write, I still make music. I don't really go out and perform. I try to engage and contribute in a way that uplifts and creates opportunities for other artists. And I see that as sort of an agnostic contribution in terms of who those artists are. But I do try to be very intentional about where and how I'm making those opportunities so that they are provided for those who are best suited to take the most advantage of them and who need them most. And oftentimes in the United States, the intersections between socioeconomic hardship or a low-income background cross-cut throughout racial lines, right? Which is why, left of center and progressives in the U.S. focus often on gender and racial identity, precisely because Black women, Black trans women in particular, are on the furthest end of receiving any sort of social support, whether it be through some sort of federal legislation or simply culturally in terms of the way we interact with each other. And so to that end, when you're talking about race, gender, you have to also have an economic framework, right? And so when we do our work through For Learning, and I'm not sure if I'm still on track with your question or not, but we really work to focus on supporting schools that are serving young people who have been least served historically. And those people we understand are often going to be low income, likely racialized, and likely representing at a higher proportion than normal in LGBTQI2S+ demographic.
Before we move to history, I have one last question. You talked about we twice. So does we refer to For Learning?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly a lot of this informs my work here at McGill.
Could you tell us what For Learning is?
Yeah, but also a lot of it informs the work that we do at For Learning. And so For Learning is actually the outward-facing nonprofit of the High School for Recording Arts. So the High School for Recording Arts is just one quite small alternative school in St. Paul. It's very unique in many ways, which makes it one of a kind and has outsized impact on its student population. And for that reason, as a school that's been around for more than a quarter century, has had a lot of demand for its work to be brought elsewhere. Either folks want another High School for Recording Arts or they want what it's doing to happen in their schools. So a school like HSRA, even though it is a nonprofit, is not set up to serve those needs and those demands from a legal or fiscal perspective. So we incorporated a new nonprofit, and that's For Learning. And For Learning works in Hawaii, Wisconsin, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and is now making its foray into Canada here in Montreal.
Thank you for that. Very interesting and important work. We're going to talk history now. Is that okay?
I'm ready.
All right. So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think that image comes to mind?
I think that the first image that comes to my mind when I think of history, unfortunately, is like a black and white image of Adolf Hitler. And I think that is the case precisely because I was raised in a Jewish household, a predominantly Jewish household. And so was always curious about my past, my ethnic and spiritual history. And so the opportunities I had to learn about World War II and Nazi Germany, I think, were that much more impactful for me. And one of the other questions you asked in preparing for this, I think, was what is one of the earliest memories you have learning about history, right? And one of the earliest memories I have is actually building for my history day in like 6th grade or something, a model of Auschwitz. And one thing I think we struggle really hard to do today, or have always struggled hard to do when it comes to teaching history, is getting folks to connect in the now to what has happened in the past, and that hands-on opportunity to actually look at the images of Auschwitz and say, wow, okay, these fences were there, these barracks were there, these crematoria were here, and now I'm going to put it all together in something that I can see and feel, really made that not real for me, but more understandable and more memorable.
Can I ask why you and how you went about? That's a heavy topic, and going and visualizing or trying to understand what Auschwitz looked like physically. That's pretty tough.
I mean, we read Night by Elie Wiesel in 6th grade. And so we were not skirting the topic of Nazism and the horrors of the Holocaust, right? And as a young mind, I wanted to make sense of that. And I don't know why I chose to make a model, but I think part of it was the typical approaches to History Day, make a trifold board and present that, or something else, weren't so appealing to me, right? I wanted to actually build something, and my parents had always supported me in bricolage, working with my hands, and so that stood out. I also knew that History Day was a bit of a competition, and so wanted to do something more to win the competition. I don't think I did, but it was, it feels weird to say, an enjoyable experience nonetheless. And to that end, to your other point about, my personal culture influencing my relationship to hip hop, I think there is a certain element of Judaism that pushes you to ask the hard questions. And my father, was also a New Yorker. So here I was being raised by a New York Jew who wasn't afraid, and an anthropologist to boot, was not afraid at all to ask the hard questions and push me to ask the hard questions. And so there I was, this kid who was just like trying to make sense of a really wild, nonsensical world with tough questions. And ultimately, ended up building a model of Auschwitz for better or worse.
I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that experience. Could you describe a moment in time where you had to justify the importance of using history to attain a certain goal, or to be able to make some sort of positive change through your work? And what would have been your justification for using history?
To think of an explicit moment would be hard. I can think of examples that we have done as a community across For Learning in the High School for Recording Arts. One being the student-produced documentary Rondo Beyond the Pavement, which went on to win awards across like 9 different independent film festivals. And the focus of the documentary was the historically black neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was a neighborhood that the city planners at a certain point, decided to build I-94 directly through. So using eminent domain to go back and displace families just so that the two cities of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, could be directly connected by a highway.
So I-94 is a highway.
I-94 is a highway that runs between St. Paul and Minneapolis, 10-mile stretch, runs further than that, of course. But there was a moment where the city planners of those two cities decided that this highway had to be built, and the one place that they were willing to build it through was this historically black neighborhood. They didn't say, nope, we're going to uproot wealthy white neighborhoods, even though they easily could have. They chose this route. And so Rondo Beyond the Pavement, this documentary, actually goes out and interviews community members who were around at that time or whose parents were around at that time and talks to them about what it was like, talks to them about the ramifications, in part because the school is still in that space. It's still in Rondo. And so the students often will be coming to us from the Rondo neighborhood and learning about this history for the first time. And rather than using history to justify anything, history kind of speaks for itself in that instance to say, you know, you are a young person, and keep in mind the context of the High School for Recording Arts is a school that re-engages out-of-school youth, right? Young people who, by and large, on average, have been to 4.5 other high schools already before they enroll at the High School for Recording Arts. So they're coming to this school, and like I had when I was young, are having very hard questions that they want answered, but for different reasons than I had them, and are given opportunities to answer them in ways that they find intriguing. Like, who doesn't want to go out with a camera and talk to their community? Probably some folks, but our students were very excited about it and pulled together this incredible story of resilience, but also tragedy and also through lines to the ways in which their neighborhood, their community operates today, and allowed them to connect that to broader, similar stories throughout the country. The story of Rondo is the same story of the Bronx in New York. The Cross Bronx Expressway was built through the Bronx in the 70s, and it is that moment that birthed hip-hop, in fact. So at a school loosely called Hip-Hop High by its admirers, it's a very relevant project, right? But it wasn't us going to the young people and saying, wait, we think the world's underserving you, and here's the history book that proves it, right? It's like, no, you have questions. What are those? Let's ask those questions in a space that connects you to who you are, and that's your neighborhood.
So there's this disruption to the regular flow of people's lives, and then something happens, and then it instigates, for example, the creation of hip-hop or the creation of your documentary. Based on what I've understood, history for you is something that's very much alive and that people refer to for certain purposes. And in this case, it would be to reaffirm their presence, their sense of agency in the face of all sorts of adversity. So if that is correct, you can correct me, obviously, but I was just wondering, what do you think history is and what does it serve to do?
Paul, you have to work on harder questions. No, I'm kidding. What is it? That's such a complex question. What do I think history is and what does it serve to do? I mean, far be it from me to define history, but I think that it gives meaning to the now. And between the past, the present, and the future, we have our existence, right? Because we are living here, we are living now, but now would not be without that which came before it. And we would not be without the possibility of leaving something behind for the future to behold or remember us by. And I think that can be, it's interesting, right? Because I think that could be so many things. That could be the people that we impact. It could be the cultural production that we produced during our time here, whether it's art or books or podcasts or otherwise. And then the future takes that up as the past during the present, right? Like the cycle builds on itself in a way that tells me history is so much more than what I think it is and what we've just summarized it to be in my perspective. And I guess, yeah, if I were to put what I just said in a nutshell, history is both the past and the present and the future.
That's beautiful. Well said. Very interesting. Thank you for that. Now, based on what you said, would there be a difference between history done at an individual level versus history done at a collective level?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like we think about school systems change at the microcosmic level within the classroom, the mesocosmic level within the school or district or school board or what have you, and the macrocosmic level of a state or a province or a federal government, I think we can think about history in terms of the personal, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal dialogues that we're having with ourselves, informed by the interpersonal. And then, Adrienne Marie Brown talks about in her work on emergent theory, fractals, which see our immediate impacts reverberating beyond our immediate connections, right? So you and I might have this conversation and you might go talk to somebody I have never met and will never meet. And you mention something I mentioned to them, right? And that impacts them and they go remix that in whatever way, who knows? So yeah, absolutely. History is rhizomatic and multidimensional and complex, for sure.
Is history a good thing or can it also be a bad thing?
Both. History is the worst and the best. We find all of our inspiration in historical moments of resistance and success and triumph. I think when we frame them within an individualistic context, we lose. We lose community, and we uplift this notion that we are operating independently in a world where we very clearly are not. And I think that that's one of the major shortcomings, for example, of the American paradigm, this notion of individualism and the Horatio Alger story and the American dream and the thought that we can all equally pull ourselves up by our bootstraps when all the data tells us it's not the case. But then through a different lens, right, through a communal lens, oftentimes through indigenous approaches to storytelling, our origins, and the like, we start to connect history in a more communal way. We start to understand that we come from somewhere. We start to understand that we come from somewhere that has resisted all sorts of violence, all sorts of attempts to squash whomever we are. And I think that goes across the board if you go back far enough, right? Even I, as a cis white man from a middle-class background, if I go back far enough, my father's ancestors fled Belarus during the pogroms, right? There was somebody there trying to shut us down. And that matters, right? Because that connects me to the fact that there are people now who are, I should say, facing systemic forms of violence, different from those that my family faced, but that shared historical experience connects us. And then if we start to understand the ways in which trauma lives from generation to generation, literally within our bodies, we can start to, even at a biological level, understand that history is quite literally within us in a communal way, right? We are not living intergenerational trauma because one person somewhere experienced trauma in a vacuum, right? They experienced trauma at the hands of others and lived through it in connection with others.
Interesting. Thank you for that. So let's try to go full circle.
Okay.
This is the last question.
Great.
How does history connect to hip hop? Is there a connection? And if so, how do they connect to each other?
Oh, how does history connect to hip hop? I mean, hip hop came out of a time where young Black and brown individuals in New York were really suffering at the hands of those who held power. Those were, by and large, white men. That is a tale as old as time in North America, right? So in that sense, hip hop is historically rooted. And just because they were at the whims of those forces and the powers that be, and I speak of them amorphously, but it's Robert Moses, it's the politicians behind Robert Moses, who was a city planner, and the city planner that was selected despite his well-documented racist history to be the city planner in charge of the Cross Bronx Expressway. It was also majority white landlords running slum-like tenements in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and other boroughs, literally committing arson on their own properties to collect insurance premiums. These were the kinds of things that the the citizens of New York who then birthed hip hop were experiencing, while at the same time coming from these incredibly beautiful cultural traditions of jazz and dance and visual art and so forth. And so when it came to be too much, they sought opportunities for release, right? And those opportunities were literally parties. You know, it was, I think, either 1967 or 1976, I forget which, when DJ Kool Herc threw the first quote-unquote hip-hop party, Sedgwick Avenue, and DJ'd for the first time as we know DJing to exist today. Young people were breakdancing in the ways that we know breakdancing to exist today. And MCs were, at that time, just hype people for the DJ. You know, everybody in the place to be, put your hands in the air and follow me. Kool Herc on the ones and twos, what it do? Break it down, you know? Simple stuff. And the rap artist evolved out of that. And the DJ evolved out of that to become the producer. And the EDM DJ evolved out of that to be, you know, the movement of electronic dance music that we know today. So much of today's music on the pop cultural front has been informed by hip hop and R&B. But I say all of this because those art forms that composed hip hop culture at the time, MCing, DJing, graffiti, and breakdancing, all have historical origins that run much further back. The griots of Jamaica, Africa, came to, I would say, birth offspring, families, members, right? Lineages that landed in New York and became the progenitors of hip hop. So yeah, absolutely. Hip hop is historically rooted. It is one of many forms of revolution. It is one of the only, I would say, forms of artistic and creative revolution that in its origin had that revolutionary spirit and then went on to become a global phenomenon. You know, in hip hop, we say that anybody born after the 1980s has lived in a world fundamentally altered by hip hop. Nobody after that moment knows a world without hip hop. And a lot of what we're seeing now, again, I'll say it, across fashion, visual arts, and music have been directly informed by hip hop.
That's nice. Thank you for that. So you described the lineage, the story, but I have one last question, and I'm happy that you described this because this is going to be a fun question, I hope. You talked about the lineage, the story of hip hop, but now when someone lives certain experiences, all experiences ultimately would be historically rooted, and then they decide to create hip-hop music, how then does history connect to hip-hop? How would that person's understandings or experiences of their life and their lived history come to connect with hip-hop? Because you have this lineage, this story, there's this like flow moving onward, like you suggested, but then people decide to maybe become a hip-hop artist, or they find hip-hop as a great way to express who they are and their needs, and it's very philosophical and social and political. But then how would they latch on? Is there a connection between lived historical experiences and then connecting on to the story of hip-hop, or would that be two different processes? I don't know if I make sense.
I mean, I think it depends on the person. Even within my own story, you see throughout my process of conscientization, to borrow Freire's term, this beginning where I'm connecting with hip hop because at a very early and uneducated level in my formative years, I gravitated to the answers hip hop culture was providing to the questions that I wasn't getting answered elsewhere. But then much later on, once I started to understand myself within a broader communal context that is also historically rooted, I started to pivot and reconsider my relationship to hip hop culture in a way that I hope is more ethical and responsible. And so I cannot speak for every hip hop artist or every member of hip hop culture. To do so would be inappropriate, but I can speak for myself and say that if my own experience is an example of the ways in which we come to understand history over time, perhaps the answer to your question is that it depends on the degree of knowledge one has about their own history, their communal history, and this often is why we engage our work in culturally sustaining pedagogies, an approach to teaching and learning started by Sami Alim and Django Paris that says we should be in classrooms or in schools, whether they have classrooms or not, connecting our young people to the elements of their heritage cultures that have actively resisted oppression. What are those pieces? That's where hope lies. Let's uplift those. But we should also be acknowledging that our young people are the creators of new culture. And so seeing them through an asset-based lens allows us to do what I think was done with the Rondo Beyond the Pavement project, which, by the way, I was not an actively involved educator on. It's something that other people are responsible for, so I take no credit. But that project saw us connecting young people to their histories in ways that identified how folks lived through the upheaval of the construction of I-94 through their neighborhood, while the young people were making something that contributed to our cultural zeitgeist right now. And so that is culturally sustaining pedagogy, I think, at its finest. And in doing so, they hopefully, as some of them hip-hop artists, others documentarians, were more deeply connecting themselves to history in a way that informs their art.
Michael Braun Lipset, thank you so much.
Thank you.